us. But I felt that before we start the formal business of the bilateral, it would be inappropriate to let this moment, tragic moment, pass without saying something about the shock which all of us in Dublin felt and the true sadness which we experienced when the news came through on Tuesday morning of the tragic death of Brian Kerr. I think all of us knew him well, some even better than well. He had been a great friend of the Dublin courts, was a regular attender at functions, meetings and the like, which we organised, and was always more than willing to be of any assistance he could in maintaining relations, in particular between the judiciary north and south of the border. I suppose we all have individual memories, happy memories, which it is often useful to reflect on sad occasions such as this. But my own involves the call of his son John to the Irish Bar. As many of you will know, the tradition in Ireland, both in Belfast and in Dublin, is that newly qualified barristers are formally called to the bar in court by the Chief Justice or Lord Chief Justice, as the case may be. And during the tenure of my predecessor, Susan Denham, John Kerr was called to the bar, and she invited Brian to sit on the bench with myself and two other colleagues for that very happy occasion. I suppose it's always a good idea on occasions like this to reflect on the very many happy memories which we have of our many interactions with Brian. I wonder, would colleagues from the other jurisdictions like to add their own comments in relation to Brian?
Well, thank you, Frank. I gave a tribute to Brian on Tuesday when we were all still in shock, in which I spoke mainly about his career and our sympathy for his family. I won't repeat now what I said then, but I might say something more about Brian's contribution to the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom and to the law, both on and off the bench. All judges have to strike a balance between the need to apply established principles in the interests of legal certainty and the desire to develop the law where necessary to do justice in the individual case. Different judges strike that balance at different points. Brian was more determined than most to correct injustice where he saw it. That led to his being described as the conscience of the court, a not unimportant role in a final court of appeal. It also led to his writing more than his share of dissenting judgments, but he also left a rich legacy of majority judgments, some of which have affected the lives of countless members of the public. 3 examples immediately come to mind. The first is the case of Montgomery and Lanarkshire Health Board, where he and I co-wrote the judgment of the court. The judgment established that medical professionals owed their patients a duty to take reasonable care to explain to them the available treatment options and the risks that they involved, so that the patient could take an informed decision. On the facts of the case, that resulted in an award of damages to a woman whose obstetrician had failed to inform her of the availability of caesarean section, although she was known to be at high risk of complications during labour, with the result that her baby was born with multiple disabilities. The second case is Stocker and Stocker, which established that allowance had to be made for the hasty and informal nature of social media postings when considering whether they were defamatory. But Brian was probably proudest of his contribution to re-NIHRC, the Northern Irish abortion case, where he was one of a number of justices who expressed a view that Northern Ireland's law on abortion was incompatible with human rights law. As a result of the attention which the judgments attracted, the law was reformed earlier this year. Brian was also exceptionally kind to counsel appearing before the court, patient where some other judges might have grown impatient, and often coming to the rescue of those who found themselves in difficulty. sometimes to the frustration of his colleagues who had put counsel into those difficulties. Off the bench, Brian was a supportive colleague without any hint of arrogance and without the slightest rancour towards those who disagreed with his views, however strongly they might be held. He was regarded with the greatest affection by the court staff and perhaps especially by the young people who came to work at the court as judicial assistants. He ran the judicial assistant scheme, chaired the court's users group, and also chaired its IT committee, where he led many of the developments which enabled the court to adapt so quickly and so well to the exigencies created by the current pandemic. The only reproach which could be levelled at him was that if he had the warmest heart, he also had the coldest room. No one wanted to linger in meetings there, and one year's JAs even took the house plants in his room into protective custody during a particularly cold snap. He had an impish sense of humour. All that's missing from the photograph that we can see is the twinkle in his eye. In his retirement to spending more time with his family, to returning to practice as an arbitrator, and to returning to the House of Lords. It's the greatest pity that he was unable to do so.
Might I add a few words of my own? Robert, you've eloquently expressed the enormous contribution that Brian made as a judge in the Supreme Court. None of us, however, will overlook the extent of his public service through the law long before he got to the Supreme Court. As Crown Counsel in Northern Ireland, as a High Court judge, and as Lord Chief Justice of Northern Ireland, and for a very brief period as a member of the Judicial Committee of the House of Lords. I got to know Brian reasonably well once he was in London, and there was no one who was better company at dinner or over a drink. You've mentioned his sense of humour, which was undoubtedly a very strong characteristic, none of it born of any unkindness or malice to others. And importantly, he showed great interest in the work and careers of others. But Frank has mentioned that now might be a time for one or two personal reflections rather than legal reflections. I first got to know Brian when I was a young Queen's Counsel, imported from London to deal with a number of cases in Belfast when Brian was in the High Court and was the Judicial Review Judge. I can see Seamus Tracy looking into his camera, as it were, into my eyes, and Seamus will no doubt remember one or two outings that we had against each other in Belfast all those years ago, 20 years ago, I should imagine. And I can say that as an outsider, the welcome I got from Brian was very generous, and I was the beneficiary of his kindness as a judge. And I was reflecting on Tuesday when I heard the tragic news of his death, of one exchange we had, which I'll repeat if I may, and may need to save Seamus's blushes. It was a difficult judicial review. There were extensive pleadings, and Seamus had drafted a not altogether short skeleton argument. When he stood to open the case, it was entirely different from anything in the pleadings or in the skeleton argument. And I made a mild objection, a very mild objection. And Brian looked me between the eyes and he said, "Well, Mr. Burnett, in this jurisdiction, pleadings are just aspirational." And it was the most charming way of telling me to sit down and let Mr. Tracy, as he then was, get on with his arguments. So I have really fond memories, and I wish I had known Brian better.
On behalf of the judiciary and the wider legal community in Scotland, I too would like to express our great sadness at Lord Kerr's premature passing. He leaves a lasting legacy, in particular on the law governing Scotland's devolution arrangements. He made several illuminating contributions, often in the form of dissent, to Scottish criminal procedure as it ran the gamut of Article 6 challenges in the United Kingdom Supreme Court in the post-devolution era. The Faculty of Advocates Human Rights and Rule of Law Committee tweeted its tribute recently as follows. Lord Kerr's human rights judgments were insightful. He was not afraid to disagree strongly, always respectfully, a man of principle. He certainly was not afraid. As Lord Reid noted in his video message marking Lord Kerr's retirement, he was elevated to the bench in Northern Ireland when judges and their families required to be guarded around the clock. And he might have been forgiven, therefore, if he had thought of the recent criticisms of judges and lawyers in the political arena as mild in comparison. Shortly after his retirement, however, he was quick to defend publicly the necessity of the legal process applying checks on government. He was a man of principle indeed. On a personal note, and I echo the words of Lords Reid and Burnett, I had the pleasure of sitting with Lord Kerr on occasion in the UK Supreme Court in a case involving the planning of St Andrews. We met many times on the legal social circuit in London, Belfast, Edinburgh and Dublin. I echo the comments which have been made about how good company he was on these occasions. I will retain very happy memories of these indefinitely. He will be very sadly missed by us all in Scotland.
Declan, I think we can't hear you at the moment.
Hi. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now. Thank you very much.
All right. Okay. Brian Kerr practiced law in this building for nearly 40 years. Indeed, for the last 5 of those as Chief Justice, in part from the very seat in which I'm sitting. He was obviously an outstanding lawyer with a strong independent streak, and he's left a body of jurisprudence which will long survive him. But that's not primarily what I want to recognise this morning, because first and foremost, Brian was a friend to all of those with whom he served in this jurisdiction. He retained a keen interest in the Northern Ireland judiciary and professions throughout his life, and that continued during his time in the Supreme Court. As some of those on the link today will know, if Northern Ireland Council were appearing in the Supreme Court, they were not allowed out of the building until they'd come to his coffee ostensibly for, or come to his chambers ostensibly for coffee. But it generally turned out that there was something more substantial in offer for those who made their way there, which was usually much appreciated. And indeed, in this jurisdiction, all of us were recipients of the hospitality provided by Brian and Gillian, both at their London flat when we were there and in Tonickmore House. Others have referred to his lively sense of humour, and I just want to mention that he had what many of us have, a single transferable joke, which in his case was rather self-effacing, and it concerned Lord McDermott and a monkey. Lord McDermott, after his retirement, occasionally came back to hear divorces, and when hearing divorce applications had a habit of picking up some further point from the petitioner, which counsel had managed to miss. So Brian was determined in this particular case that should not happen. The divorce was based on the unreasonable behaviour of a husband in the keeping of his monkey, which caused all sorts of horrendous difficulties within the marriage. And Brian meticulously took this lady through her account of the animal's misdeeds, sparing absolutely no detail. Of course, the Baron knew exactly what he was at, and Brian was satisfied that he covered all the bases and then finished his evidence. And the Baron sat there for a while, and then eventually he turned to the lady and said, "Can you tell me what sort of monkey it was?" And of course, she didn't know. The Baron smiled, declared himself satisfied that it was a macaque, and granted the divorce. But the news of his passing was a tremendous shock to the entire legal community, and undoubtedly will take a little time to sink in. He still had much to offer, both professionally and personally. He had just been appointed by Queen's University as an honorary professor, and I know that there were many plans afoot for his participation in the life of the university, as well as those matters to which Robert referred. And certainly in this jurisdiction, our thoughts are with Gillian and John and Patrick. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Can I just finish by sending the deepest sympathies, not only of those of my colleagues who are on this link, but also the entire Irish legal community, to those who served with him judicially and to his family and friends. Thank you all very much.